What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of the most difficult games I have 100% for one reason or another, because lately I've been going through my own backlog of things that have been difficult that I've been putting off, and that's kind of been my goal for 2025, so naturally it's been on my mind, and it was quite the surprise to me to learn that it had been like 2 years since I talked about this, and I've reviewed a whole lot of games since then, so I thought it might be fun to dive into the subject and talk about it, and mention even a couple of older ones that I haven't talked about in some time. Now, to get some, in my opinion, obvious stuff out of the way here at the beginning, though, what difficulty means to me and what it means to somebody else are two vastly different things, and things I find difficult, some people will find easy, some things I find very easy, other people will find very difficult. For instance, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is probably, I would say overall, one of the most difficult games that I have actually finished and gotten 100% on, but I love that game, and so to me, I wouldn't really have considered it all that insanely difficult outside of one or two things. Whereas other people are going to see the 500 plus hours that's going to take you and say absolutely not. And with that in mind, these games aren't meant to be like, this is the most difficult thing you could do, but rather, these were difficult for me and here's the reason why. So it's not really a top list so much as it is just interesting anecdotes about these individual games. But with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive into it. Talking first about a game I haven't talked about in a while, I would say, and that is actually Hard West 2. This is a TRPG that released towards the end of 2022, and it does some interesting things. Set in a supernatural Wild West thing, which was all the rage that year, you had to collect various poker cards that you could then put into poker hands as power-ups for your characters, which determine their level of power and abilities they had access to and whatnot. It was a pretty good time. But this game was actually a pretty difficult 100%, but not exactly for the reason you would think. You see, in fact, these days, it's a much easier thing to do overall, and that is because back when I played this game, it was before they wound up nerfing a particular character you could fight called a Blackheart, which was an absolute nightmare to fight, on top of the fact that towards the game's launch, it had some pretty restrictive round limits. That is to say, you had to complete the combat encounters within a certain number of rounds, and they've since slacked off on that as well. So there were several missions in this game where you'd fight these enemies called Blackhearts, which could teleport away from you, full heal if you had hit them at all, and also damage your character basically all in the same round. And the only way to effectively kill these guys was on your turn, spend basically every one of your actions putting one of them down because they had enough health that that's what it was going to take, at least in the vast majority of cases. And there were some fights that had like 3 or 4 of these guys. They were awful to fight, especially with that turn limit. Now again, thankfully they have been nerfed since, so if you were to play this game now, it would actually be much easier if you wanted to 100% it, but those particular fights were very challenging, and I remember them, I guess, not so fondly, but it's an otherwise fun game you should check out if you haven't, assuming you're not busy enough as it is. Next up, though, we've got a game that I've barely talked about at all, to be honest, and that is Bloodless. So Bloodless first showed up on my radar when they reached out and asked if I wanted to do a sponsored video for it, which I did in fact do, by the way. And that is because after checking out the game that they sent over, I enjoyed it. I was like, yeah, this is pretty cool. I don't mind covering it. And while I never went on to review it, just because I didn't really have anything else to say about it, I did wind up playing it some more. And that is because it was a pretty unique experience. Basically, it was a counter-based combat system set in this isometric view you can see with a really distinctive art style. The gist of it is most enemies have attacks and things that you can counter by sort of dashing into them. And then if you go a bit farther, there's all sorts of like crests and things and techniques you can learn to actually attack instead of just purely countering. But that's the bulk of the game. And as a result, it's actually a pretty challenging experience. So while 100% on this probably won't take you a super long time, it's a pretty reasonable game to do 100% on, actually. It's just that the combat of this is especially challenging. It's a system that's not all that dissimilar from like parry mechanics and proper like Souls-likes, that type of thing. But it's set in the challenge of those old school isometric type games where it was almost bullet hell on the screen and you're trying to see what's going on and you're balancing all these enemies fighting you. And for me at least, if you couldn't tell by everything that I cover on this channel, it was a very unique experience that challenged me mostly because I hadn't played a lot of games like that previously. And it was intriguing enough to me that I went on to 100% it basically on my own time. Moving right along though, now I want to talk about a game that I used to talk about all the time but haven't much recently, and to my surprise, wasn't really on any previous versions of this list, though I do remember specifically talking about some of the bosses for it. But that game is actually Divinity Original Sin 2. Once upon a time, I used to basically be a Divinity lore channel. I would just cover all the lore of all the Divinity series games. I love them, and I'm very excited to see what Larian does next after BG3, and I am sincerely hoping it's another Divinity title. But Original Sin 2 could be a difficult game to 100% for a variety of reasons, not least of which because of the late game difficulty spikes it's known for, the challenging honor mode, etc. But what really held me up were two fights that were basically back-to-back towards the end, which was the Kraken followed on by the sort of vampiric bat right before you step into the City of Arcs. Now, for me, the real challenge was beating these guys on honor mode, which is effectively an Iron Man. And the Kraken, if it isn't, spewing frost at you, locking down characters, it's hitting you with extremely strong attacks, so just a dangerous enemy in general, and it didn't help that it sort of hard countered my preferred way to play. The real one, though, was the vampire bat thing. So this enemy healed constantly, and on honor mode it heals a lot. So basically what you have to do is permanently lock this guy down if you want to do that fight legitimately, so to speak, to where it just essentially can't hit you at all. And by itself that wouldn't be a big deal, but naturally you're not fighting just that enemy, there are several others you have to deal with, and as a result of it, that is just a fight that took me a lot of tries because there's not really any way around it. And if anything, that winds up being a good thing because the fights that await you in the city just beyond this guy aren't going to get any easier for you. And I imagine it's exactly for reasons like that despite being out much, much longer, Original Sin 2 actually has a much lower 100% completion rate, so to speak, than Baldur's Gate 3, even with the addition of its own honor mode. But that brings us to number 4 on the list, and this is Black Myth Wukong. Now this game, as you might imagine, was difficult for a few different reasons, but if you remember my review for it, I actually mentioned that as these games go, I didn't think it was terribly rage-inducing, let's say. But there are two things that stood out to me about this one in particular. So for starters, you had the sort of lack of information right around the launch of the game, so I was doing this right around the time that the guides were actually in progress. So some of this stuff I just had to figure out alongside other people and sort of piece together other information, and I even linked some of the guides I used in that review, if I'm not mistaken. So that was honestly challenging in its own right. But there is one boss in particular for this game that really just wiped the floor with me repeatedly, and it was right at the end of the game. It was the very last boss. Now every once in a while when I'm playing a game, I'll mostly be breezing through it before suddenly hitting a brick wall of a boss, which happens on occasion, and it's a massive difficulty spike, which for Black Myth Wukong just happened to be the final boss. And that's basically because everything I had been doing up to that point simply did not work against this guy, and I had to just about relearn the combat systems just to take this guy out. It was very challenging. And a lot of that is because he's basically you, but with more health. He can do a lot of the things that your character does. It's a multi-phase fight that is just very over the top. And it's that fight just combined with the challenge of having to figure a lot of this stuff out on my own, which honestly isn't an experience you could entirely replicate now, unless you were just deliberately going offline, I guess. But in some ways, I would say it's kind of like Hard West 2. It's more about when I 100% it, more so than the overall difficulty of it. Which brings me to my last entry, actually, and this is Armored Core 6. So, a game from Software, a games company known for its challenging titles, but I wanted to list Armored Core 6 for a few different reasons, but mostly that it was the first time I had played an Armored Core game. So this is one of those games that came out and a lot of people were asking me to review it, but I was like, I've never played any of these. I don't know what this is about. So I'll give it a try and see how it goes. And much to my delight, it was a great game. I had a ton of fun with it, talked about that in the review, and obviously went with the angle of somebody coming to that series for the first time, given From Software's success with other genres. And while there are certainly a handful of areas of this game that can be quite challenging, by far and away the most struggle I had with it was a boss called, I think it was Ibis Series, something like that. I always called it Cell 240, but I'm pretty sure the community calls it something else. But I remember this guy because about a third, a little under a third of my initial playthrough of this game was just me getting destroyed by this single boss. So Armored Core 6 isn't a terribly long game. If you're good at it, it's very short, actually. Realistically, main story playthrough, you're looking at like 12 to 18 hours for most people. And for me, my first playthrough was about 15 or 16 hours, and I spent about 4 of those hours getting absolutely wrecked by this boss. And it probably doesn't help that it is one of the famous two-phase bosses, so to speak. That is to say, you put it down only for it to get back up and do more crazy stuff. And the first time it did all that, I just remember thinking to myself, oh, I'm going to be here a while, which remained the case. I definitely lost more time to this fight than anything else, because this is one of those bosses that moves in a way that is very, I would say, just difficult for me to follow, which happens sometimes. Famously, at least for me, with God of War 2018. There's a boss in that game that just moves really erratically and it's hard for me to get a beat on it. And this boss was much in the same vein of that. It was just very difficult for me to actually follow what this thing was doing. I had a really hard time, deciphering its telegraphs before it moved into various attack patterns and stuff. And it took me a while and a fair bit of research on what other people were doing to actually beat this guy, which was especially funny to me because most people complain about a couple of the bosses earlier in the game. Like, for instance, I think there was one called Baltius, something like that I know a lot of people had trouble with. But with that said, I think you kind of get the gist. So there has been 5 of the pretty difficult games, I would say, that I have 100% over the years. Tried to pick some more interesting ones, things that had some stories attached to it this time. So hopefully you enjoyed that. And I would certainly love to hear about any difficult games you have completed or challenges you've overcome, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.